the Premier of BC has absolutely no constitutional authority to block a pipeline. Will the Prime Minister stop hiding behind the powerless Premier, get out of the way, and approve a pipeline to the Pacific today?
I'd invite the member opposite to buy a ticket to Calgary tomorrow to see how a federal government works with the provincial government to build Canada strong.
Tomorrow, the Prime Minister will wave around in the air a worthless piece of paper that he says that the Premier of BC can veto any time he wants.
Maybe the member opposite should explain to his constituents why the Premier of Alberta wants to stand beside our Prime Minister and talk about how to build Canada strong.
We're set to get that long-awaited memorandum of understanding on energy between Alberta and Ottawa tomorrow. Now, it's the federal government's first step in response to Alberta's push to get a new bitumen pipeline built to BC's northwestern coast. So we know that it makes Alberta Premier Danielle Smith pretty happy, but one province west, BC's David Eby, remains staunchly opposed. Back to dig into the political play, here is their front bench: Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. Laura, one of the things that I think I want to start with here as well is the sort of the inter-caucus dynamic because of the number of Liberal BC MPs who are in a position here. How is that playing out?
This is a big challenge for the Prime Minister, right? We actually can't deny that. We can't talk about this MOU and a pipeline without talking about the fact that the Prime Minister has a political challenge. He has a number of BC MPs, a number of Quebec MPs who historically have been very opposed to this pipeline and who are also trying to balance the same thing he is, which is, frankly, a pretty progressive base, pretty progressive voter base, with the need to strengthen our economy, the need to show each province that their economies matter to the Prime Minister and to the country. But what's also clear to me when I watch this is that, and watching the budget, the Prime Minister is a betting man. And he has decided to bet on a pipeline. He's decided to deliberately walk one of the most difficult paths for a Liberal Prime Minister to walk, talking about pipeline politics and putting some money on that, while also attempting to strengthen some environmental policy with what it looks like the caveats are going to be.
Yeah, and Jamie, at the same time, he continues to almost downplay what we're expected to see in the MOU. I mean, he continues to say, look, this is not the deal, this is the pathway to it. And he continues to use this language around it, almost, not to say undercutting what we're all expecting tomorrow, but certainly tempering those expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, Mike. And I think part of the challenge of what you're seeing here is actually looking at just how rancorous and divisive pipeline debates have been in Canada over the past 15 years. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity for the Prime Minister working with United Conservative Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta to rewrite this script and rehab this debate and get more Canadians on side that we saw in the past, not only for national unity, which is ultimately what it came down to when the Trudeau government intervened to nationalize and follow through on the expansion of what was then the Kinder Morgan project, but to actually get the economy growing in this country in the face of what we see south of the border. And so it's going to sound, I think, a lot more government speak than it will be engineers talking about where pipelines are going to be and how it's going to be fitted. But I think part of the debate that needs to play out here over the coming weeks and months to actually get this thing built is to actually educate the public on the state of modern engineering, how tanker traffic actually works, and all the safety precautions that are in place so that oil spills don't happen, and the kind of like worst of ducts covered with oil like you saw in movies in the 90s is just frankly not a reality today because of modern engineering, and the men and women who work in the industry are able to do it. And I think you're going to see that debate take out, and I think part of what you're going to have to see for that to be successful is to have less of the name calling that you saw in the past, where radical this and radical that, and kind of like two people never talking to each other, and actually work on convincing skeptics. The ardent opponents who are going to be radically opposed to this, they're not ultimately the audience, because you know they're going to be against it no matter what. They've shown themselves to be against all development in this country for a very long time. But for people who are skeptical, and for people who also have concerns about climate, especially in that Liberal voting coalition, to speak to them directly to say, here's how we're mitigating the climate piece, here's how we're actually going to be able to this built, and here's all the environmental protections that are in place thanks to the ingenuity of technology and Canadian men and women working in the industry. That is, I think, the message the Prime Minister is going to sell. The fact that he has Premier Smith potentially making that with him, I think makes it far better for Canada that this pipeline gets built. And so, yes, I think, again, you're going to see this paper process. It's an MOU. We'll see what other buzz clips come out of it in terms of the term. But I think this is ultimately laying the foundation to actually resolve the impasse we've seen in pipeline politics in this country for 15 years.
How important is that, Sharon, then tomorrow in the language that the Prime Minister uses and to Jamie's point, really kind of explaining it as much as possible, to Laura's point as well, to make sure that he's not only speaking to Canadians about it, but also to people within his own caucus about how he can walk and chew gum at the same time?
It's going to be extremely important. Listen, like everyone has said, pipeline politics in this country has been one of the most divisive conversations to be had. I can speak from both perspectives of having worked in government when we acquired TMX and the type of rhetoric that came out of both sides during the discussions and the negotiations. And prior to that, having worked for TC Energy when we tried to build Keystone and Energy East and crisscrossing this country and trying to understand what makes people tick when it comes to pipeline politics, the language the Prime Minister uses is going to be vital. But what I can say, and I can't emphasize this enough, I know people are going to say an MOU is nothing, but it is the foundation to something that is extremely important, I would say even beyond pipelines, which is national unity. The West has felt extremely alienated, and in some cases, rightfully. The dialogue has been pretty divisive, and there's been cabinet ministers who have used tone and tenor to kind of express their views on that. And I think this is a really pivotal moment where we do not see Danielle Smith speaking out against Carney. And I think tomorrow we're going to see them pretty hand in hand in looking at what the future of pipelines in Canada can look like. And you know what, Premier Eby is going to have a bit of a rude awakening on his front too, because I do think he is missing some of the political calculus here.
Sebastian, what does this do to Conservatives here in Ottawa who have often gone to that card and sort of played that card of saying, well, Liberals aren't building a pipeline, they'll never build a pipeline, they'll never be behind it. If indeed we see that sort of pathway in the MOU, what does that do to Pierre Poilievre's argument over whether or not Mark Carney can get big things done and big things built in this country?
Well, Mike, forgive me for not sharing the enthusiasm for this theater production that the panel has and that the Liberal-friendly media has been feeding to Canadians and especially Carney's boomer base. Here's the reality of what's happening tomorrow. Prime Minister Carney is going to put on a fantastic and wonderful show. He's going to, once again, sign a piece of paper that is otherwise, by his own assertion, rather meaningless. Just yesterday, Prime Minister Carney said that this MOU will create the necessary but not sufficient conditions for a pipeline. So what is the whole point of going through this process? I think it's, once again, Prime Minister Carney putting on an incredible show for Canadians on every side of the spectrum to reveal himself to be something that he is not, which is somebody who can actually get things built and get our resources to market. As long as Conservatives continue to point this out, and as long as Prime Minister Carney prevents himself from building a pipeline, which under the British North America Act, I know this is kind of boring, Section 92 permits him to build this, even despite Premier Eby's objections. Until he actually does that, I think Conservatives are in solid shape and will continue to point out this hypocrisy.
But Sebastian, even if he's standing beside a smiling Danielle Smith?
Well, I hope Premier Smith is smiling. I would be smiling too if I was beaten over a bat by the previous Liberal administration for a decade, and now someone is putting out a gentle peace offering. It would be absurd for her to say no and spit in the face of that. But again, why doesn't Prime Minister Carney set out a date for when this pipeline will be built? He's been asked that, and just yesterday, again, he said that really downplayed his own plans and ambitions for this MOU.
All right, last word to you, Laura.
I do think that we're missing a key part of this, which is they need a proponent, right? Like they do need a private sector proponent or proponents at some point. And so,
because right now Alberta's the proponent.
Correct. Right now Alberta's the proponent, but this is a really important step. And I think just focusing on it's just a piece of paper misses a really key part of what Jamie was saying, which is we do need to neutralize pipeline politics in the country. We have to be able to have a conversation about the natural resources we have available to us, responsible ways of getting those to market, and growing the economy nationwide, while we're also giving a chance to every province to have their sector propped up. And we're seeing some of that with, for example, the huge amount of projects in BC on the MPO list. So I do think the Prime Minister is actually setting us up for a pretty powerful portfolio that private investors can look at and feel like there's going to be some support here. Yeah, and we'll see whether or not it's a lunch bag letdown tomorrow, as Sebastian maybe is thinking, or we'll see how it goes either way. Okay, thanks to the front bench, Laura D'Angelo, Sebastian Skamsky, Sharon Carr, and Jamie Ellerton.